Right now, you are punishing yourself for something. Maybe it's a missed workout. Maybe it's the hour you spent scrolling instead of working. Call it discipline. But what you're actually doing might be something else entirely. You tell yourself that hating your habits into shape is the same as building better ones. It isn't. And the difference between these two things is quietly deciding whether you succeed or fail at almost everything you attempt. Think about the last time you missed a goal. What did the voice in your head sound like? For most people, that voice is sharp. It says you're lazy. It says you always do this. It says you'll never change. This feels like motivation. It feels like the tough love that will finally whip you into shape. But psychologically, it is doing the opposite of what you think. Researcher Kristen Neff has spent years studying what happens inside the brain when people fail at a goal and respond with harsh self-criticism versus self-compassion. Her findings are almost the reverse of what most people assume. People who treat themselves gently after a failure are more likely to try again. People who punish themselves are more likely to give up entirely. Why would kindness outperform punishment? Because punishment activates threat. Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a predator and your own inner critic. When you call yourself weak or lazy, your body responds the same way it would to any perceived attack. It braces, it defends, and a body in defense mode is not a body preparing for growth. It's a body preparing to survive. This is the first crack in the myth. Self-punishment feels like accountability, but underneath it, it's fear. And fear-based motivation only works for a short burst before it collapses. Self-discipline works differently. It isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it doesn't announce itself with guilt or shame. Real discipline looks almost boring from the outside. It's the quiet decision to do the next right thing, regardless of how you feel about yesterday. Psychologist Roy Baumeister, known for his research on willpower and self-control, found something that surprised even him. Willpower is not an unlimited resource. It depletes throughout the day, the same way a muscle tires after repeated use. But here's the part most people never hear about his research. The people who preserved their willpower longest weren't the ones gritting their teeth the hardest. They were the ones who had built systems that required less willpower in the first place. In other words, discipline was never about forcing yourself through sheer will. It was about designing a life where you didn't need as much force to begin with. Think about how this plays out at work. Organizational psychologists have long studied what happens to performance under punitive management, the kind of boss who rules through fear, criticism, and constant correction. The finding is consistent across decades of research. Employees under punitive management don't produce more. They produce less and they hide more. They stop taking risks. They stop admitting mistakes early when they're small and fixable. Instead, they wait, hide, and hope no one notices until the mistake is too big to hide anymore. Now notice something uncomfortable. That is exactly what you do to yourself when your inner voice runs like a punitive manager. You don't take risks with new habits because failure feels dangerous. You hide your slip-ups from yourself, sometimes for weeks, until the shame becomes too heavy to carry. You are managing yourself the way the worst boss you've ever had managed you. And just like an employee under that kind of leadership, you're not becoming more disciplined, you're becoming more avoidant. This is where self-punishment quietly sabotages you. When you rely on guilt to get yourself moving, you're burning your limited willpower on emotional damage control instead of using it on the actual task. You're not disciplined, you're depleted. Have you ever noticed that the harshest periods of self-criticism are usually followed by the biggest crashes? That's not a coincidence. That's the nervous system running out of resources to sustain constant threat response. Shame spikes motivation for a moment, then collapses it. Discipline, on the other hand, sustains motivation because it isn't drawing from fear. It's drawing from identity. This is the part almost nobody talks about. Self-discipline isn't really about behavior at all. It's about identity. Kelly McGonigal, a health psychologist who studies willpower, found that people who succeed long-term at difficult goals don't see the goal as something they have to force themselves to do. They see it as an expression of who they already are. A person who identifies as someone who takes care of their body doesn't need to punish themselves into the gym. A person who sees themselves as lazy and undisciplined has to fight their own self-image every single time they try. The battle isn't happening at the gym door. It's happening in the identity underneath. Psychologist Carol Dweck's research on mindset adds another layer to this. Dweck found that people generally operate from one of two beliefs about themselves: a fixed mindset, which assumes your abilities and character are set in stone, or a growth mindset, which assumes abilities can be developed through effort and strategy. Self-punishment almost always comes from a fixed mindset. If you believe you simply are a lazy person, then every slip becomes proof of a permanent trait. But if you believe discipline is a skill you're building, the same slip becomes nothing more than a rep that didn't go well. Same event, completely different psychological aftermath. This shows up outside of gyms and to-do lists too. Think about a friendship where you canceled plans last minute. If you spend the next hour calling yourself a flaky, unreliable friend, you're not actually building the discipline to follow through next time. You're building shame, and shame makes people withdraw rather than show up. Research building on Bandura's self-efficacy framework finds the same pattern in relationships that it finds in habits. People who believe they are capable of being reliable act more reliably. People who believe they've already proven themselves unreliable start avoiding the friendship altogether because it's easier to disappear than to face a version of yourself you've decided is broken. This explains something you've probably experienced but never had language for. Why does punishment work for a week and then completely fall apart? Because punishment tries to force behavior change without ever touching identity. You can yell at yourself into a 5-day streak, but the moment that streak breaks, the identity underneath, the one that still believes it's lazy, takes back over immediately. One missed day turns into total collapse, because nothing about who you believe you are has actually shifted. Self-discipline built on self-respect doesn't collapse the same way. A missed day is just a missed day. It's data, not a verdict on your character. Neff's research on self-compassion found something almost paradoxical here. People who forgive themselves quickly after a slip are statistically more likely to return to the goal the very next day. People who spiral into self-criticism after a slip are statistically more likely to abandon the goal completely. This is the real difference between self-discipline and self-punishment. Discipline treats failure as information. Punishment treats failure as proof. Notice the language you use with yourself after a setback. Do you say, "That didn't work? Let me adjust"? Or do you say, "Of course I failed, I always fail"? One is a system correcting itself. The other is an identity confirming its worst belief about itself. There's a reason this feels so hard to unlearn. Many people were raised in environments where punishment was the primary tool for behavior change. A raised voice, a withdrawn approval, a comparison to someone who did better. This wires the brain to associate self-improvement with self-attack, because that's the only model it was ever shown. So when you try to change something about yourself as an adult, punishment is the only language your inner voice knows how to speak. But that voice was never actually you. It was installed, and what was installed can be rebuilt. Rebuilding it doesn't mean lowering your standards. This is the misunderstanding that keeps people stuck in the punishment cycle. They believe self-compassion means letting themselves off the hook. Neff's research directly contradicts this. Self-compassionate people don't have lower standards. They have more sustainable ones. They hold themselves accountable without collapsing their self-worth every time they fall short. There's a related concept worth knowing here from psychologist Albert Bandura, whose work on self-efficacy shaped decades of behavioral science. Self-efficacy is simply your belief in your own ability to execute a task. Bandura found that this belief is built primarily through small, repeated successes, not through pressure or punishment. Every time you follow through on something small, you're not just completing a task. You're collecting evidence for your own nervous system that you are someone who follows through. Punishment destroys this evidence bank. Every harsh self-attack after a failure teaches your brain the opposite lesson, that you are someone who doesn't follow through, which makes the next attempt even harder to start. Discipline, at its core, is simply the ability to act in line with your values, even when your emotions don't agree. That's it. It was never about hating yourself into motion. It was about trusting yourself enough to keep showing up, especially when you don't feel like it. Here's the modern mirror. Every time you scroll past a missed goal and think, "I'll just start tomorrow, I clearly have no discipline," you are reinforcing the exact identity that guarantees you'll struggle again tomorrow. And every time you catch yourself mid-spiral and instead say, "This is just one moment, not the whole pattern," you are quietly rewiring the story your brain tells about who you are. You don't need to punish yourself into becoming someone new. You need to start acting in small, consistent ways, like the person you're already trying to become. Right now, you are not failing at discipline. You've just been using the wrong tool. And the moment you stop mistaking self-punishment for self-discipline is the moment real change finally becomes possible.